Hi, I'm Kelly. The blare of my alarm clock was the first battle of my day. In our cramped yet over-decorated home, filled with Mrs. Melan's expensive tastes, my space felt suffocating. Like I was an intruder in my own life. Mornings were always a whirlwind, preparing for work while making sure everything at home was perfectly in place. But no matter how fast I moved, Mrs. Melan's voice would slice through the air, sharp and cold. Kelly, you're always rushing. A good wife takes her time to care for her home. I'd force a smile, trying to keep the peace. I've got a big project at work, Mrs. Melan, you know how it is. Her disapproving click of the tongue was like nails on a chalkboard. Work, always work. When will you learn? Charles, my husband, sat silently behind his newspaper, sipping his coffee, as detached from me as ever. No support, no encouragement, just him and his indifference, drowning in a sea of newsprint. One evening, exhausted from a long day, I walked through the door, hoping for a rare moment of peace. Instead, the house was eerily silent, and Mrs. Melan was waiting, her eyes gleaming with that familiar contempt. Charles was nowhere to be found. Late again, no dinner, no care for your family, she hissed, her voice like ice in contrast to the warmth I had tried to create. I had an important meeting. Charles understands, don't you, honey? I turned toward him, but he didn't even look up from his phone. Just a shrug. His silence was a dagger, cutting deeper than words ever could. Days turned into weeks, the same pattern. Mrs. Melan's criticisms grew sharper, while Charles's silence grew heavier, suffocating me in a home that felt more like a gilded prison. I was the intruder, she the warden. Then came the dinner that changed everything. I prepared everything meticulously, desperate for a peaceful evening. But the tension was already thick as we sat down to eat. Charles, as usual, said nothing. Mrs. Melan's critical gaze lingered on me like a predator circling its prey. You never get things right, Kelly. Always about your job, never about your family, she sneered, her voice harsh and unrelenting. I swallowed hard. I'm doing my best, Mrs. Melan. Balancing work and home isn't easy. That's no excuse. You're neglecting your duties, she snapped, her voice rising with an anger I had never seen before. The next night, the kitchen buzzed with the sounds of clattering dishes as I prepared for yet another tense meal. The aroma of dinner filled the air, but all I could smell was my own desperation. Charles was already seated, glued to his phone, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Everything has to be perfect. Mother expects it, I muttered under my breath while setting the table, every move filled with dread. It was like walking on eggshells, always trying to meet her impossibly high standards. As we sat down, Mrs. Melan's eyes scrutinized everything. Her lips curled in disapproval. You really should try harder, Kelly. A good wife keeps a perfect home. I sighed, holding back the urge to scream. I do my best, Mrs. Melan, but my job is demanding. Your job, she spat the word like venom. Always your job. What about your duties here? Mother, please, can we just have a quiet dinner? Charles finally spoke, though his voice lacked any real concern. She ignored him completely. You neglect your husband, your home. It's disgraceful. Her words stung, but I kept my focus on the table, my fingers trembling as I reached for the salt. And that's when it happened. In a flash of rage, Mrs. Melan's hand shot out, her fork stabbing into my arm. The pain was sudden, sharp, and searing. Mother? What the hell? Charles shouted, a mix of shock and irritation in his voice. You brought this on yourself, Kelly, Mrs. Melan hissed, her eyes wild with fury. Always provoking me with your ways. I stood up, clutching my arm, the blood beginning to drip through my fingers. My heart pounded in disbelief. How can you say that? You just attacked me. It's your own fault, Charles muttered coldly. You always push her too far. Tears welled up in my eyes as I fled from the table. The pain in my arm, nothing compared to the crushing weight of my heart. Alone in the bathroom, I watched the blood trickle down, a grim reminder of the prison I was trapped in. Hours later, I found myself in the emergency room. The doctor's voice was distant, almost drowned out by the buzzing in my head. Surgery. The fork had done more damage than I thought. Lying in that sterile hospital bed, the reality of my life hit me harder than the pain in my arm. There was no word from Charles, no concern from Mrs. Melan. Just silence. And then my father walked in, his face a mixture of worry and fury. Dad, my voice cracked. What are you doing here? He stepped closer, his voice heavy with emotion. I came as soon as I heard. How could they do this to you? I tried to smile. I tried to reassure him, but the tears came unbidden. I don't know, Dad. I just don't know anymore. Sitting beside me, he took my hand, his grip firm and comforting. Kelly, there's something you need to know, he said quietly, his voice steady. I've been a silent investor in Charles's family business for years. My heart stopped. What? Why didn't you tell me? He sighed, looking at me with a mixture of guilt and determination. I wanted to help in my own way, but after seeing this, after seeing what they've done to you, I can't stay silent anymore. I won't let this stand. His words were like a revelation, a shift in the air. As I lay there in that sterile hospital bed, recovering from surgery, a plan began to form in my mind. This was my turning point. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. I won't let them get away with this, Dad. Not anymore. He squeezed my hand, his eyes reflecting my resolve. Neither will I, Kelly. Neither will I. As the beeping machines faded into the background, I knew with a startling clarity that my life was about to change forever. The quiet, submissive Kelly was gone. It was time for them to see who I truly was. Days later, after my discharge, I found myself alone in the house. Charles was out, likely lost in his own world as usual, and Mrs. Melan was conveniently absent. It was the perfect opportunity. I went straight to my laptop and sifted through the footage from the hidden camera I'd installed in our bedroom months ago. Ever since I'd started to suspect Charles was cheating on me, my heart raced as I scrolled through the recordings, and then there it was. The proof. Charles in our bed with someone else. The betrayal stung, but it didn't break me. Instead, it fueled my resolve. This was the ammunition I needed. Armed with the evidence, I called my lawyer. I want to file for an at-fault divorce, I told him, my voice unwavering. I have proof of his infidelity. The lawyer's tone was all business. This is a strong case, Kelly. We'll make sure you get what you're entitled to. As I hung up, a wave of empowerment washed over me. But this was just the beginning. That evening, when Charles returned, I confronted him. The moment I'd been dreading, but also anticipating, had finally come. You've been cheating on me, Charles. I have the proof. He scoffed, his arrogance unmistakable. You're paranoid, Kelly. It's all in your head. I held up the photos. His face paled, his bravado faltering. Still think it's my imagination? He stammered, trying to come up with a defense, but his facade was crumbling. Kelly, it's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, I said, my voice cold and firm. I'm filing for divorce. His shock quickly morphed into anger. You'll get nothing from me. But I was ready for that. We'll see about that. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings and confrontations. My father, true to his word, withdrew his investment from Charles's family business, sending shockwaves through their entire family. Mrs. Melan was frantic when she found out. You can't do this to us, Kelly. This is our livelihood, she screamed. I'm doing what's right for me, Mrs. Melan. I replied calmly. You and Charles have wronged me, and I won't stand for it anymore. Charles was a wreck, alternating between begging and threats. You're ruining me, Kelly. You can't do this. I already have, Charles. You brought this on yourself. The weight of their financial ruin pressed down on them. A reversal of roles that I couldn't have predicted. They were now the ones feeling the pressure, the stress. It didn't bring me joy, but it brought me justice. I spent my days planning my next steps, rebuilding my life piece by piece. The house, once a symbol of my suffocating existence, now felt like a battleground where I had claimed victory. With each decision, my strength grew. I was no longer the woman who tolerated disrespect and betrayal. I was someone stronger, someone who refused to back down. Each night, as I lay in bed, I realized this was just the beginning. There was more to fight for, more to reclaim. My journey wasn't over, but I was ready for whatever came next. The day of the divorce proceedings, I walked into the lawyer's office with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and above all, determination. My evidence, neatly compiled, sat in front of me. Charles and his lawyer sat across the table, his face a mask of barely contained rage. His lawyer flipped through the photos and videos, his expression turning grim. This is substantial, Charles, his lawyer said, his voice low. Did you know about this? Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It's not what it looks like. Photos don't lie, Charles, I said, my voice steady. And neither do videos. His lawyer sighed, leaning back in his chair. This changes everything. We need to talk settlement. As the negotiations dragged on, Charles's defenses crumbled. The realization of his downfall was evident in his eyes. By the end of it, the settlement was brutal for him. Half of his assets were coming to me, but it was more than just the money. It was a declaration. I would not be underestimated again. Back at home, Mrs. Melan confronted me, her face twisted with fury. You're destroying this family, Kelly. Destroying Charles. I stood tall, my newfound strength unshakable. No, Mrs. Melan. You destroy yourselves. You won't get away with this. We'll fight you. She screamed, her voice filled with venom. You've already lost. The news of the settlement and Charles's infidelity spread quickly. Whispers followed them wherever they went. The once respected family was now the subject of gossip and pity. Meanwhile, Charles's family business, already struggling, crumbled under the weight of the scandal. Employees left, clients withdrew, and the debts piled up. Their empire was disintegrating before their eyes. Charles came to me one day, desperation etched on his face. Kelly, please, I'm begging you. You're ruining everything. I have nothing left. You had everything, Charles, and you chose to throw it away. I made a mistake. Please, can't we fix this? I looked at him, the man I once thought I'd spend my life with, and felt nothing but resolve. It's too late, Charles. You made your choice. As I walked away, a sense of closure washed over me. The man I once loved was now just a painful chapter in my past, a lesson learned. One evening, as I sat down to dinner with my father, he smiled at me, pride in his eyes. You've grown so much, Kelly. I'm proud of you. I smiled back. Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you. With each passing day, my independence blossomed. I took control of my life, my finances, my future, my happiness. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was a survivor, a fighter. The downfall of Charles and Mrs. Melan was not a source of joy, but in the end, it wasn't about vengeance or retribution. It was justice. Charles and his family had created their own ruin through their actions and choices. I was merely the catalyst, the one who finally stood up and said enough. As I lay in bed at night, the silence of the house wrapped around me like a blanket of peace. Gone were the days of walking on eggshells, of feeling small and unworthy. I have faced my fears, stood up to my oppressors, and emerged stronger. This chapter of my life was closing, but a new one was just beginning. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that I had the strength to face it. When I moved back to my parents' house, the familiar sights and smells welcomed me like an old friend. The house, with its walls filled with memories of a happier, simpler time, was now my sanctuary. Sitting in the kitchen one morning, my mom poured 2 cups of coffee, her eyes full of unspoken questions. You know, she began softly, I never understood how you managed to stay so long in that house. With those people. I took a deep breath, the weight of the past months still lingering on my shoulders. I guess I thought it was what I had to do, to make it work. But I was wrong. She reached across the table, her hand warm and reassuring. You're home now, Kelly. That's all that matters. In those first few weeks, the peace and quiet of my childhood home were a balm to my wounded spirit. I spent hours walking in the garden, the flowers and trees a beautiful contrast to the cold, opulent prison I had left behind. One afternoon, while strolling through the local market, I unexpectedly bumped into someone, Charles. He looked different. The arrogance that had once been so ingrained in him was gone, replaced by a humbler, almost broken demeanor. He noticed me and hesitated before approaching. Kelly, how are you? His voice was softer, unsure. I looked at him, the man I had once loved, now a stranger with a shared past. I'm good, Charles. Better than I've been in a long time. He shuffled his feet, offering a sad smile. I heard about your father pulling the investment. I'm sorry for everything. I nodded, the past a closed book. It's done, Charles. We've both moved on. Yeah, he sighed, glancing down the street. I'm working at the coffee shop now. It's different, but it's honest work. I could see the change in him. Life had humbled him in a way neither of us had expected. I'm glad you're finding your way, Charles. As I walked away, leaving him behind in the bustling market, I felt a sense of closure. Life had come full circle for both of us. Back at my parents' house, I spent evenings talking with my dad about life, about my plans for the future. His unwavering belief in me was a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. "You've always been strong, Kelly," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, the sun setting behind us. "Stronger than you ever realized. I'm proud of how you've handled everything." I smiled, feeling content for the first time in years. "Thanks, Dad. I feel like I can finally start living my life on my own terms." Each day was a step towards healing, towards rediscovering who I was before the chaos. The scars of my past were still there, but they no longer defined me. I was more than what had happened to me. One night, as I sat in my old room, gazing out at the stars, I reflected on my journey, from a woman trapped in an oppressive life to one who stood up for herself and fought back against injustice. I had found my voice, my strength, and most importantly, myself. The future stretched out before me, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with my own colors. For the first time in a long time, I was excited about what was to come. I was free from abuse, free from control, and ready to embrace whatever life had in store for me. This wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. A new chapter in the story of Kelly, a woman who survived, who overcame, and who emerged stronger. As I closed my eyes that night, one thing was certain: the best was yet to come. Kelly's journey is one of resilience and empowerment. If you found yourself in her position, would you have taken the same steps to seek justice, or would you have chosen a different path? This story is a reminder of the strength we all possess, even when we feel at our weakest. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more tales of courage and triumph. Thank you for being part of this journey.